joined today by John Peirce, who is the author of Work Less: New Strategies for a Changing Workplace. This is John's fifth book, and it's out on Amazon in Canada and in the US now. And I will have links to where you can get that in the show notes. So John, thanks for being here. I wanted to start out just by asking you what compelled you to write this book?
I actually tell the story of how the book came to be in its first introductory chapter, where I was culling my books and I came on a book called Working Harder Isn't Working by Bruce O'Hara. And it reminded me that I had once done a lot of research and been very interested in work hours, but I'd forgotten about it. So on the basis mainly of the book's beautiful color, I decided to keep it. That was probably the best known Canadian book on shorter hours in the 1990s, which was when I first started working on this topic. So after that, I was just browsing the CBC Internet News one day, and I found a piece about a Canadian firm that had gone to a 4-day week, both for recruitment and retention reasons and to improve the health and morale of its existing staff. And I was so impressed by that that I wrote a CBC opinion piece. And to my amazement, because I haven't done all that well in freelance journalism in recent years, CBC Opinion took it and they put it on the internet, and it went viral in a minor way. I got a radio and a TV interview on CBC, and they actually had to cut off commenting when the number of comments reached 4 digits. So at 1,000, they shut her off.
Oh, wow.
And then I got an invitation by, I forget whether it was a phone call or an email, from a guy named Scott Fraser, who was the publisher of Dundurn Press. And I'd never heard of him, although I knew Dundurn because I had friends who published with Dundurn. And he asked me, just on the basis of having read this piece and been impressed by it, if I would like to write a book on work hours. And I said, sure. And about a month later, I had a contract. So this is how this book came to be. I had no intention of writing one originally, and it was Fraser's idea, not mine. But I'd like to think it was a good idea.
Right. So from all of your research and all the work you've put into this, give us a quick summary of, like, where does the shorter work week stand now? Is it being used? Is it prevalent? Are governments trying to legislate it? What's the status in 2024?
This is the stuff of my last substantive chapter before the recommendations. What are we doing now? And the picture is extremely varied all over the world. The trials of the shorter week done by 4-day week global have done a great deal to popularize the concept of the 4-day week in particular. In my book, I call for a 32-hour week because I'd like to give people different options. Perhaps some people would prefer 5 shorter days, and I don't see anything wrong with that if that's what they prefer. But in the United States, there are a lot of private sector trials, but not much in the way of government action. There is the one bill federally and the one in California that I think you know about already. Canada, there was a bill introduced by NDP, that's a Social Democratic Party legislator. I don't know where that stands now. It had kind of stalled in the conservative-dominated legislature the last I checked. I think maybe there's more promise in Europe. Countries like Iceland, Scotland are going toward it. I think Germany, which is the world leader, will very likely put in something like that while there's a social democratic government in power. IG Metall, the biggest union, always works closely with the Social Democrats when they form the government. And this has been one of their big issues for many decades. Um, there are various countries as well outside of Western Europe and North America that are playing around with it. Even some firms in Brazil are trying it out, and I'm impressed by that. And even a couple of efforts in Japan, certainly Australia and New Zealand. There's a wide range of efforts of varying degrees of probability of adoption is all I can say. It's a going thing, it's a living thing, but it's not a sure thing.
Yeah, and that so from my research, which we've spoken about, I try to keep up with the companies that are using a 4-day work week, 32 hour it could be. Um, and I found 330, I think, currently. Now, that's only if I can find their public announcement of it. It's really if only English speaking or companies that would release the announcement in English. I'm not looking in other languages. So it's like English speaking companies that have announced their 4-day work week, which there's plenty others that haven't. But I've really only found like 300 or so. We could say maybe it's a few thousand that are using it, which to me would still be a small fraction of all the companies or all the employees working out there. Like most people are still on a 40-hour work week. Is that would you agree with that? Is that kind of where we are as far as the employee or company side adoption?
I think most people might be a slight overstatement. A majority of people probably, but you see, one of the things you've left out is the public sector. And I think there's a lot of this in the public sector. Belgium, for instance, had something for the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
They just put in, and Canada Canada had a compressed week in the public sector and federal government back in the 80s and 90s. So there's lots of stuff going on in the public sector, and public sector organizations tend to be large.
Yep.
So we're
Yep.
talking about thousands of employees for the average public sector organization. So if
Mm-hmm.
you if you're only looking at the private sector, then you're certainly understating the total number of employees.
Yeah. So this is like you mentioned in the 80s and 90s and previous to that. I mean, I think John Maynard Keynes was talking about this nearly 100 years ago, right? And there's been multiple movements to try to implement a shorter than 40-hour week. What sort of what's the history of pushing for a shorter work week? If you could summarize it for us.
The leadership on this issue was taken first by the United States, or in the United States, with the Kellogg Company. And when you read my book, you'll see that I have a bit on the Kellogg experiment. And during the Depression, starting about 1930, they brought in a 5-day week with a 6-hour day. And they used to post in their job ads, "Go home for lunch and don't come back." So they had a shift that went from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. and you could go home for lunch and you didn't have to go back to work. And that was quite successful as long as the company management continued to support it. This was in the 1930s, and it caught on, and several other large firms, including Goodyear Rubber, adopted it. Herbert Hoover, oddly enough, we think it was a Democratic initiative, but Herbert Hoover was much bigger on this than was Roosevelt. Herbert Hoover was one of the progressive managers of the 1920s, and he saw the shorter work week as a way to increase productivity and later to create jobs. Unfortunately, the Congress didn't follow along. Roosevelt came in, and oddly enough, he put the kibosh on a great experiment, or not an experiment, a piece of legislation called the Black Connery Bill. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. No.
That was, I mentioned it in the book. That's a bill that would have brought in the same kind of hours that the Kellogg's had, a
Mm.
5-day week and a 6-hour day. And it would have legislated this as a maximum. And to me, it makes perfect sense in the Depression as a way of sharing limited jobs, if nothing else. But
Hmm.
this bill passed the Senate by a margin of better than 2-1. Its chief sponsor was a senator named Hugo Black, who was later named to the Supreme Court by Roosevelt, became a famous jurist. But for some reason, the business community got to Roosevelt, although he'd originally supported the measure, as had his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. And he suddenly started opposing it, and it didn't get past the House, which is a great tragedy. He did bring in the Fair Labor Standards Act late in his second term, and that provided for a 5-day week with an 8-hour day, which was still a great improvement over what most people had. And the only other significant industrialized country to go that far was France, whose socialist premier Léon Blum modeled himself very closely on Roosevelt's New Deal. But the 30-hour week could have been easily adopted in the United States in the early 1930s. That's a great tragedy, and they never came close to adopting it again. So we are struggling to get to where we were tantalizingly close to almost 100 years ago. That's enough to make a grown man cry, Henry.
Right. Well, so also since then, we have just more and more technology, right? And a couple of the big ones, the internet, and then more recently, artificial intelligence, which are um, collapsing the time it takes to get something done in a desk job or knowledge work, and then potentially outright replacing it or getting rid of it. And the other one's like automation and software that's in between. So it's like internet, software, automation, artificial intelligence, all that stuff has come out much more recently, but they're still not. Um, so we're seeing the trials, we're seeing companies do it, we're seeing sort of countries propose it is maybe the phase it's at, but we're not there yet. So with all of that technology collapsing the amount of time it takes to do something in your job, why haven't we seen it? Why aren't we there with a shorter work week?
Because employers appear to prefer to grind the bejesus out of their workers if they can, unless they are forced to do otherwise by either legislation or severe competition if they're in a sector in the market economy where they face severe competition for labor. And there is quite a bit of competition in the labor market now, including the high-tech market. And I think that's what's driven the 4-day week movement as much as anything in North America, where the tendency to legislation isn't as great as it is in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But what people haven't realized, the last person to actually seriously recognize this was Henry Ford, was that not only does this technology make work more efficient, it makes work much more intense and physically and mentally demanding for workers. So they should receive a shorter week in compensation. It makes much more sense to give people a shorter week than to give them more money. Because, when Ford's assembly line first came out, one of the workers said, I'm more exhausted at the end of my 8-hour shift on the assembly line than I was at the end of 12 hours at my previous job, where whatever they had was nowhere near as efficient. And that's the way technology works. Now, Ford was not, some sweet altruistic angel. He had a terrible problem keeping his staff when he first brought in his assembly line with the old work week.
Yep.
You know what his turnover rate was the first year he had his assembly line?
No.
Take a guess. Close to 400%.
Wait, what is What
That
does that
means
even mean?
average, that means that the average worker stayed only about a quarter of a year. That
Oh,
there's
right. Okay, I see.
or the average worker only lasted about 3 months. So
Wow.
people quoting with their feet. This one technology writer I read just said they hated it.
Yeah.
They quit.
Yeah.
So that's obviously not a sustainable formula for continuing to operate an automobile company. So he said, well, I have to do something to keep people. He wasn't going to get rid of the assembly line, but he shortened the hours, and then he became the employer of choice because he
Yeah.
had the 8-hour day, and which allowed people enough time to drive the cars they made, and their wage of $5 a day, which is a very good wage for those days, allowed them enough money to buy the cars they made. He wasn't stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in the night, I think it was this was in the 19 teens. In the later 1920s, he moved to the 5-day week,
Hmm.
even before Roosevelt mandated
Yep.
it with legislation.
Yep.
But he was about the only one who recognized that intensifying technology required a shorter week. And we had the first wave of computer technology in the 1980s, and the week didn't get shorter. And we had Zoom, and if anything, it got longer, and people got sicker and sicker. And there are health effects from spending whole days on Zoom that we're still toting up. And
Hmm.
you have to have much shorter hours and maybe even different schedules with Zoom. Like one of the things that I've noticed is that if people are working from home with Zoom all day, it might make the split shift a viable proposition, which is in conventional businesses where you work uh, in an office or a factory or a store, split shifts are anathema because it means 2 trips to and from work every day. But
Hmm.
if you're staying at home all day, that it doesn't have that same stigma. It doesn't have that same difficulty. And it means, in fact, if you're a woman with family responsibilities, you can take care of your children or your housework in between. And if you're just a regular guy worker, maybe you can play tennis or even golf in between your shifts or go for a walk or go for whatever. So
Yeah.
the split shift becomes an attractive option with Zoom. That's
Right.
just an example of how this is
Yep.
going to affect work scheduling.
It 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 could be a good stepping stone to where it ultimately goes, but in my mind, with remote work, um, you don't need shifts at all. There's no people should basically be able to work whatever hours they want to get the job done well, and the company should be able to manage the quality of the output of the work and how valuable the work is, and not care at all about shifts because it's not the shift work isn't. It's kind of like it's hanging on from manufacturing, but this is using your brain. Like we're having a conversation right now, or you're writing a book, or I'm writing something for my website that people are going to read. Those are so far removed from like putting a car door over and over onto a car. So in my mind, like the 4-day work week, and I think I've written this before, like 4-day work week, a remote company, for example, implements the 4-day work week, or they implement split shifts, like you said, that's an improvement on just sitting on Zoom for 8 hours a day, a huge improvement. Eventually, there's no shifts, and that's was my experience personally running a remote company. Is that we went from fully remote, just everyone's on for we were at 36 hours a week. Then we went to 4-day, 32-hour week, and we ran that for a year or two. And we eventually just realized just get your work done. And that was it. There were really no more hours at the end of it. And I think that um, a lot of people that do a 4-day work week in a remote setting experience that. I actually think that's sort of a stepping stone, the structured shift work toward asynchronous work.
Well, certainly we have reached a point with most jobs involving brain work, where what is produced, the productivity is no longer a linear function of the number of person hours worked.
Exactly.
The basic assumption of manufacturing. The
Right.
reason that we may
Right.
need to continue some sort of shift is not because of the work itself. And I agree, I'm a writer and well, I have some kind of a shift, I suppose. I tend to work best in the first few hours after I get going in the morning.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be any particular time of day, but a time of my day. So there's no point in my trying to write at night because I have measured it and I'm only 10% as productive at night as I am in the morning.
Right.
And everybody under a remote work pattern would need to look at their own productivity and see how it works for them. The reason that we
Yeah.
may need some kind of shifts isn't because of the work world, it's because the work world has to fit into a larger world, and there are other parts of the larger
Yeah.
world that will continue to operate in regular schedules, particularly the schools.
Right. Right.
So you need some sort of scheduling to dovetail with that. But I don't think the work, I agree with you about the work. It doesn't really matter. I don't care if somebody does his work at 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If I'm a
Right.
manager, I just want to know that at the end of a certain time unit, and I think for me, the good time unit, if I were a boss, would be a month. I'd like to know once a month what this person has accomplished in that month.
Yeah. And that's something else I experienced as well running this remote 4-day company is we went from weekly meetings to bi-weekly to monthly, or we went from hour-long meetings to half-hour to 15-minute check-ins. And you can find time that was built into a 40-hour week that isn't super necessary. And you can reduce that time or remove that time and improve like the visibility of things, how we're working together, um, without having to meet so much. Because sitting on Zoom meetings is awful all day. It's terrible. There's no, it's really draining. And
Yeah.
yeah, if that, so I agreed with you there. And you also had a good distinction that, yeah, what I'm really saying is people should be setting their own schedules that optimize when they're thinking well, right? So for me, I work best on deeper work early in the morning, and I can work in the afternoon, but I better be doing the more shallow tasks like responding to emails or doing something sort of repetitive. So yeah, everyone, I think post shorter work week, it's really just like people building their own schedules if they're in, like you said, brain work. Um, I'm I'm curious though, as we wrap up here, what so you know the title of the book is Work Less: New Strategies for a Changing Workplace, and you said you had some recommendations in there. What I don't want to take the whole book, but what are a couple of those strategies you've come to recommend that how to implement this?
Well, I recommend right to disconnect legislation,
Hmm.
recommend giving employers a little more latitude in the 30 by making a 32-hour week and giving them 2 years to fully change over to it because it will take time for some of them instead of say forcing them into one schedule. I don't think that's helpful particularly.
Hmm.
So I'd rather look at the total quantum. And I think that even the trials at the 40-week global were that way.
Yep.
Uh, I recommend legislation to keep employers from, you know, doing sort of spy movie type of monitoring of people at working at home for electronic devices. That's an area that has to be addressed. And I recommend a great deal of education, getting the unions involved, having adult education deal with the work hours issue, that sort of thing. So the public
Yep.
has to be well informed. And there was a well informed public that people were soaking up adult education in the decades before the First World War and immediately after it. And it was this educated public, as much as anything else, as well as all sorts of new leisure opportunities, places like Coney Island, Jones Beach. See my New York background here. I could go to. That was providing support for the short week. And it was the 20s where the huge the biggest progress was made. And these people were driving it because
Hmm.
they were talking about it and studying about it. And even the management was sympathetic. That's why the 20s stand out so much, because the management was on board with it,
Hmm. Yep.
led by people like Hoover and the Kellogg's.
Yep.
So it's a broad-based approach, many different strategies, and I try to give the employers some time and latitude, but I do think that legislation is necessary, especially if we look at the whole workforce, because that means the public sector. And you don't have the forces of competition at work to the same extent in the public sector.
Yep.
Then you have a greater need for legislation. But eventually we will have to come up with a form of complete social cost accounting that measures up the cost to the healthcare system of all the people who go in there because of overwork. And that's the kind of thing that I see us doing in the longer term. Because if you actually measured that, you'd see shorter work week could bring in really huge savings. Look at all these people who go in with heart attacks and stuff like that.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's tragic.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine.
This is totally preventable. This is not new. We've known about these effects for at least 50 years. There was a guy named Harvey Brenner who was studying this 50 years ago.
Yeah.
This was old material when I was at the Economic Council, and that was almost 40 years ago.
Right. Yeah. It's crazy.
Very slow learners, as my friend Harold Tausch would say, very slow learners.
Well, it's going to get crazier too, because AI, and I've been using that more and more as part of my business. I mean, it collapses the time it takes to do a task with your brain. I mean, it's pretty crazy. So that's going to continue to go that way. More people will be working remote, which immediately saves an hour at least a day commuting, right? So like the service time of the work time is already being removed through remote work, if you know what I mean by that. And then AI is sort of accelerating like pushing down the amount of time it takes. So people are going to be needing to do less and less to get the same amount of productivity. Um, and we'll have to see where it all ends up. But that's going to be happening no matter what. Well, whether employers want people to continue to sit on their computer to 5 p.m. after that's going to be it'll be interesting.
Well, we're going to have to redistribute the workforce because there are still going to be many jobs that are needing to be done for which AI probably can't substitute, like
Yeah.
especially jobs involving personal care for others.
Right. Yeah. I'm only speaking about desk jobs. I
Yeah.
totally, there's whole other very important sectors that aren't impacted, that people need to actually be physically in one place to do it, of course.
And these jobs right now we're seriously understaffed and they're undervalued. So we need a whole redistribution on the
Mm.
workforce. And these are the ones that had a lot of people quitting as a result of the Great Resignation, I have a whole
Right.
chapter on the Great Resignation in the book.
Yep. John, we have to wrap up, but I appreciate you coming on today. I'll have links to the book in the show notes, and I hope to catch up soon.